Hello, nerds. Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Today, author Tom Dunkel with his book, White Knights and the Black Orchestra. Awesome name, awesome book. We're going to talk about some Germans trying to take the Nazis down from the inside, all true stories. Why don't we just get to talking about it then? I'm going to shut up now. Let's get Tom in here. Tom Dunkel, let's bring him in. And here we are with author Tom Dunkel, White Knights and the Black Orchestra. Tom, thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome, Brendan. Thank you for having me.
Now, besides an author, I need to ask this question. You say you are a freelance journalist. How much is freelance like what we see in the movies, where you're just kind of riding around from crime scene to crime scene and you're taking down big business? Is that basically your day-to-day when you're not writing books?
No, exactly. And then there's all sorts of beautiful women calling me all the time and asking what I'm going to write next and what I'd like to interview them. Yeah, no, that's pretty much how it goes. The freelance business, as you can imagine, like every other aspect of our society in the digital age has changed dramatically. So I'm embarrassed or saddened to say that there's been a number of magazines I wrote for that didn't survive, particularly the pandemic took a major toll on some of the travel magazines. And the past couple of years, I've been primarily focused on this book. So my last major freelance piece was for the Washington Post in May of 2018, which was a long cover story. And I had to pull off this book for 3 months to work on that Washington Post piece. And I just couldn't afford to take any more time off from the book because you got to get back up to speed on your book research when you leave it three months. It takes some time. So my emphasis heretofore will probably be on book work and occasional magazine pieces. Who would have thought that Time Inc. would not survive the digital age? I mean, that's how much the landscape has changed, but that's affecting almost everybody's business.
We know it's not actually like the movie, but what is it actually like on a day-to-day basis when you say you're freelance? Like, is there like 2 or 3 places that you can, almost always sell an article to? Or does the articles come to you and, you might have somebody reach out to you and say, hey, we need somebody to write this up? Where does an article usually start when you're a freelancer?
It works both ways. You're not going to be able to make a living as a freelancer if you can't generate your own story ideas. If you sit back and wait for the telephone to ring, you can have a long wait sometimes. So if you are to succeed as a full-time freelancer, you better be able to generate story ideas and better be able to figure out what markets are best for those ideas. And then ideally, which is what it was like when I was doing almost full-time magazine work, you have a stable of places that you work for. I did a lot of political writing, adventure travel writing, and sports writing. So I had editors at those 6 or 7, Sports Illustrated and Washington Post and National Geographic Traveler. I was a contributing editor there. So you're juggling those balls, and sometimes you have the luxury of getting too many assignments at once. The whole choreography of freelancing is tricky, and it takes time. And it takes time to build up those contacts. If I was a young guy starting out as a freelancer right now, I'm not sure how I would go about it anymore. But in the heyday of magazines, that's how it was. It was a two-way street. Even if you're on staff at a magazine or newspaper, you better be able to come up with your own story ideas. You just can't sit back and wait for people. It's a nice luxury to have, and at times it does happen. But you've got to be your own idea machine. And that's part of why you go into the business anyhow. I mean, if ideally you always have your antenna up to be looking for story ideas and jotting them down in your notebook and keeping a little idea file of things you'd like to do next.
Now, luckily, you had the idea for a book, White Knights and the Black Orchestra. Where did you find this idea? How did you decide that this was going to be a full-length book? How'd that process happen?
This was a little bit unusual. This was probably the longest gestation period I ever had for a magazine piece or a book. It began about 20 years ago. I had a friend of mine here in Washington, a woman by the name of Kristen Fellows, who at that time was, I can't remember if she was an assistant producer or an associate producer with a documentary filmmaker here in DC. And they were doing a documentary, I believe it was for North Carolina Public Television, on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who I had not heard of before. Bonhoeffer being a Lutheran pastor in Germany, who as events unfolded in the 30s and into the 40s, became involved in the German resistance. And as I said, I was not familiar with him before, so I got intrigued with that. I actually had put together a book proposal at that point. But things, a job offer came up with the Baltimore Sun, so I decided to go on staff at the Sun for a while. Then I got involved, left the Sun and got involved in another book, and then was exploring heavily a second book project. But this was always in my files. And I went back and revisited that proposal, but I thought I'm more of coming from a feature writing background in journalism, I'm a narrative nonfiction writer. So I didn't want to do a pure Bonhoeffer biography. And also in the intervening years, a couple of biographies had come out in English about him. And the more I thought about it, I wanted to, and this is not casting any aspersions or anything on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, particularly here in the U.S., people who are familiar with Bonhoeffer, it's a very compelling story. It gets a little bit romanticized, and I think Bonhoeffer himself might even be a little bit embarrassed about it. So I wanted to place him in context of the people he was involved with in the resistance. So it evolved into a kind of ensemble. I knew I wanted to do a small group of people. The book process is you write a proposal, then you get a book contract, and you begin your even more in-depth research. As originally conceived, I was going to begin the book in 1939. Bonhoeffer at one point comes over to the U.S. to study it. He gets invited back to Union Theological Seminary in New York. So he is in New York City in July of 39. He's homesick. He's missing what's going on in Germany, all of this. So he winds up going back. And that's shortly before the invasion of Poland in September 39, which essentially kicks off World War II. I was going to begin there. But as I was doing my research, I was thinking that the events leading up to World War II, we're talking about, Hitler first getting established in Munich. We're speaking into the 1920s up to the 1930s. That's almost 100 years ago now. And a lot of people don't, I think, know enough background on that. So I thought if I'm going to write about these resistors, I've got to give people enough background about what was going on in Germany and what propelled these people to take the steps they took. So what I wound up doing is moving the time frame of the book back from 1939 to 1931, which expanded, of course, the whole scope of the book. So it was an evolution from an original seed of an idea with one person as Bonhoeffer, and then evolving into an ensemble of people, but then also feeling I needed historical context to have readers really understand what was going on with these people.
You say you wanted to keep it a small ensemble. There is a lot of people in this. What I found very interesting about the way you wrote is it almost reads like a bunch of different articles throughout, because it's really short chapters and it's like, here's where we are and we're moving in time, which I find it actually really helps to kind of move everything along and make sure we're going with a different group here, we're going back to this person over here. However, that's got to be really hard as an author. All of these people over a long time period. I just imagine you standing in front of one of those big boards and you've got people's faces and tied with string and everything with a timeline up top. I mean, that's got to be difficult to keep all of these people in place, right?
It's funny you should mention that. It was not a whiteboard, but there's a version of that. What I did for this book, actually I did it for my previous book as well, as I bought artist sketch pads. We can get these big blank sheets of manila paper, and I think these are about 18 inches by 24 inches, so 2 foot by 1.5 feet. There was a process of building chronologies for every year. And then I would take all the political events that happened in the chronology of that year, then the personal events that happened with different people during that year. Then I would have a separate list of particular quotes I knew I had to get in there, or particular statistics in there. So I have these sheets of paper, and then you distill those down by chapters. You're correct. I deliberately wanted to write short chapters because inevitably, when you're writing about a group of people, you're toggling back and forth between what's going on in their lives at different times. And you can't get too many steps ahead in one person's life before you have to go back and pick up what's going on in another person's life. So I knew it was going to be that dance between different people. And I thought the best way to approach that would be in short chapters. I thought it would be more reader friendly, and also inevitably it would have to be sort of quick shifting from one person to another. You can't focus on Bonhoeffer for too many years, or you're going to lose track of Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law, Hans von Diani, who was a key person in the resistance and the person that got him involved. So it's that shifting of years, the pacing as you unwind and unspool a story. And that's part of the hard work of writing. But I have stacks of these sheets where I broke down the book that way. And then I never stick hard and fast to an outline. I usually have to know the beginning and the ending of a chapter where I'm going. But in the course of writing it, when you actually sit down and do the hard writing of it, you may do a little bit of shifting and moving around. But I need that blueprint to start putting things on paper. And you just can't sit down and start writing. I mean, you've got to have a framework here. And I worked really hard on that. In fact, at one point during the course of the book, after I'd filed the first draft, my editor thought, well, maybe we have too many chapters here. If nothing else, it eats up three pages in the beginning, listing the table of contents. So we actually went through a process where he wanted me to try to combine the chapters and cut them down to about 30 chapters. And we did that. But I said, I think we're forcing too many things together that don't fit under the rubric of one chapter. And he came around to that same thinking. And fortunately, also the publisher, Hachette, was very good about giving us extra pages for this book. As I recall, they added 150 pages to the page count. We flirted with going back to longer chapters, but in the end, it just made more sense in terms of both writer and reader pacing to do the shorter chapters.
For me, it seemed to make it more suspenseful, these shorter chapters. Before you got too into any one action, you kind of could feel that foreboding, and then all of a sudden, boom, you're on somebody else, a couple pages later. And for me, it ratcheted up the suspense. And even I've looked at other reviews, and they kind of felt the same thing that I did, that this is World War II Germany. These are German resistors within Germany. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that not everyone gets a happy ending. But the way the pace moved so quickly and jumping in between, it felt like it was making the suspense go up even more. Was that something that you were aware of as you were writing it, or is that just one of those happy accidents at the end you realized that it did that?
No, this was, again, speaking of how you choreograph a piece of writing. No, that's the stuff that you spend a lot of hours working on. And I like to, and I think most writers have what they call a kicker at the end of a chapter, meaning either something that's sort of a punch to the end of that chapter, and you work really hard at figuring out what that will be. And it's part of maintaining reader interests and to keep them wanting to keep turning pages to get deeper into a story. That's all what we sit at our desks in a dark room at 3:00 in the morning trying to figure out. That's mostly by design.
Talking about the design, White Nights in the Black Orchestra, one of my favorite titles of the year. Did you come up with it? Was this a teamwork with the editor? Where did this title come from?
No, I have to take full credit for that. And I'm not sure at what point that struck me. It was fairly easy. I can't recall any other titles I was kicking around for this book. I'd have to go back. I don't think I had a title at the proposal stage. Certainly by the time I finished my first draft, I had the title in place. And that one just popped into my head along the way. And it just felt right.
And the Nazis gave you half of it, right? Because Black Orchestra was a term that they used back then, right?
Yeah, and the full explication of the title doesn't become clear until you get into a little bit deeper into the book, both what the Black Orchestra means, and then there's also a resonance in the book with White Nights, which related to a particular novel that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was reading in prison. So it was just the merging of those two terms, and then the contrast of black and white that just seemed to fall into place. That's one of those elements of brain serendipity that happens when, again, you probably at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, one night sitting at my desk going, yeah, White Nights in the Black Orchestra, let's go.
Now, one of the things that this really brings to the front of the conversation, which it seems to me, and I may be wrong, maybe I just haven't been reading enough World War II literature, It only seems recently that stories are starting to focus a little bit more on the fact that not all Germans were Nazis, not all Germans were anti-Semites, that there was still large pockets of Germany that were trying to be German patriots, but also did not like a lot of what's going on. And this book highlights a lot of that. Is it just me, or is that something that's coming out more recently, or has this been all over the place since day one and I just been reading the wrong books?
Well, I don't profess to be a scholar on Nazi Germany history. I'm a journalist guy, but certainly from my own reading and from discussions with my editor. There's always been, from what I understand, again, on the publishing end from my editor, is that the World War II books have always sold. There's been an interest and demand for that. What I was shooting for here is that, a lot of those books are written for military history audience. A lot of them are written for, in the case of books that have been written by Bonhoeffer, are largely a theological audience. I wanted to write a resistance book from the inside perspective of people within the government, but I very much had a general interest audience in mind for this book when I was writing it. And there is, from what I understand, a little more interest in World War II right now because of obvious events that we're seeing play out around the world right now, in resurgence of authoritarian governments and fascist governments in many countries. And that has echoes back to that 1930s era buildup to World War II. So that makes, I think, that period of history less remote than maybe people once thought of it that way. It's almost like a sequel to events that were taking place in the world, particularly in the early 30s, where a lot of this was starting to first bubble up, in Germany and Italy and other countries. So I think you're correct in that there is a little bit of renewed focus on World War II, but I don't think it's ever entirely dropped off the map of reader interest. That was just such a pivotal era in world history, and there's just such a trove of good stories yet from that time. We're always finding new ones that haven't been fully told yet.
And you've got the ultimate villain that, generally speaking, everybody hates a Nazi. They're the ultimate villain. They make Indiana Jones movies so fantastic because as long as he's killing Nazis, you're not going to feel bad about who's dying on screen.
Yeah. Also, the whole interest of the collective psychology of what was going on in Germany at that time. And I think a lot of people go, oh, well, that could never happen in our country. That could never happen in anywhere else. And as you get deeper into that and take a look, you realize, well, Germany was not, let's not put ourselves on such an elevated pedestal that was somehow just a freak country and a freak period of time. It couldn't happen again and it couldn't happen anywhere else. It's the whole chemistry of what was going on in Germany is obviously fascinating, but certainly the dark turn that politics took there is compelling in its own way. People are still trying to figure out exactly how something like that gets started. When is the point where you are best able to stop it once it gets started? And the longer it goes on, the more difficult it gets to stop something like that, which is what the protagonists in this book were dealing with in real time.
And for the protagonists in the book, you have to write no pun intended, a lot of gray. Because there are characters who are, your straight white knights. They believe this is wrong. They believe this needs to stop. But then there's also people who, they're anti-Semites, but they're not Nazis, right? They don't necessarily think the Holocaust is a good thing, but they're fighting back against Nazi Germany because they don't like who the Nazis are and that they've been pushing people around. Is that hard to write all of these people in one book where you're trying to kind of show the shades of everyone and keep that straight?
You just go with where your characters take you in that respect. And even some of the characters, and probably the most grayest of all people in this book would be Wilhelm Canaris, who was the head of Abwehr, the German overseas military intelligence. He was a career military guy. I think he joined the Navy when he was 18 or 19 around the time of World War I. Canaris is part of the inner circle there, and one could consider him a very loyal Nazi. I don't think Canaris was anti-Semitic. His politics were authoritarian. He was an admirer of Francisco Franco in Spain. And yet he was providing cover to a number of conspirators at their headquarters. And without Canaris, that core group of conspirators would not have existed. And he was clearly protecting these people. But on the other hand, he was on the fence for a long time about, just what do you do with Hitler? Do you assassinate him, or do you try to get rid of him, or do you try to ride this out? He traffics a little bit in and out of the real active part of the conspiracy, but he could have stopped that conspiracy at any time. He could have turned these guys in, and he didn't do it. Also, he was reaching out to the British and the American government, trying to make contacts there. In fact, it's interesting. Alan Dulles, who was the OSS station chief in Switzerland during the war, after World War II, when we're talking about there's hearings on the Hill in Washington to whether we should establish what they were referring to as a central intelligence agency, whether we needed a permanent intelligence apparatus post-war. He testifies in the closed-door hearing on the Hill, and he was talking about how Canaris and his second in command at Abwehr was Hans Oster, how they were leaking the V1 and V2 rocket program details to the Americans, to the OSS. And Dulles was using this as a prime example of why we need to have a permanent intelligence agency. And his estimation was that the leaking of that information, and with the Allies subsequently being able to bomb the research facility, which is, I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong, was Peenemünde or something like that, set back the V1 and V2 rocket program, 6 months or 9 months. Now, in the course of a war, that's a pretty significant block of time to retard development of long-range missile program. And again, that's at the hands of Canaris. So he is the grayest of gray people there. I myself can't figure out quite what was going on inside his head, but keeping in mind that the slightest thing that you were doing that would be perceived as against the German government was enough to get you killed back then. So he certainly was aware of the risk he was taking, both with his career and with his life. And regardless of how gray his motives were, he kept pushing down that road to overthrow the government.
I mean, there are some admittedly darkly funny episodes in this book where, I won't say what it is, if one thing is put in a different spot, it would have been found months before. And I don't remember if this was Canaris, but I seem to remember a situation, Nazi higher up is screaming in an office, he turns around and walks out, and they just look at each other and say, yeah, we're not going to do that.
Yeah, that was a Canaris moment. That was Canaris, yeah.
It just felt like I was reading an episode of The Office Nazi edition, where there's just like, we're not going to do that.
That episode was where Canaris was being asked, there was an espionage component of overseas military intelligence. They wanted them to bomb the French fleet after the Nazis invade France. I can't remember which port they were targeting, but they wanted to prevent anybody from the French fleet of sailing over to North Africa. This was right around the time where Germany was thinking about launching a North African invasion. And so Canaris says, I've got the perfect guy for this mission. And he has this weird way of describing this guy. He's talking about how focused he is. Send one guy over there with bombs and I can basically take out this French fleet. And he said, the guy's horizon is no further than a toilet seat, which is a pretty odd way to describe someone's focus. And so he was telling, I can't remember if he was talking to Himmler at that time, I would think. But anyhow, he says, we got it all under control. And then he goes back to Abwehr headquarters and says, we're not doing any of that. And that was the cat and mouse game that he was playing. Now, the flip side of that is Abwehr did a lot of advanced recon work in the countries they were invading. So Canaris was sending people into Poland or into Norway. And that was certainly advancing the cause of Hitler's army. But on the other hand, to overthrow the government, you got to be in the government. So it's psychological geometry of what people were trying to figure out at that time is fascinating in its own, sad way.
And it's really interesting when you're reading history and you get to the end of a book and you're like, I don't know where that dude was coming from. Nothing he did lines up. And it's not like a TV show, right? Where sometimes writers will make people do things that are not in their character. And you're like, oh, that's just bad writing. But he's kind of a perfect example of in real life where like, I don't know exactly where he's coming from. I don't know what he was thinking in his head, what the end game was. You had a general idea of where he was going. But like you said, then all of a sudden he'd do something else. And you're like, do I like this guy? Do I hate this guy? I'm not sure.
Yeah, and also, again, going back to Canaris, there were situations where he was helping Jews get out of the country. I mean, and they did it in the Netherlands as well. One of the efforts that winds up causing so much problem within the Abwehr was wound up being called Operation 7 originally, then essentially evolved into what could be thought of as Operation 14 because it came 14 people. But these were Jews that they were trying to get out of Germany into Switzerland disguised as Abwehr agents. They sold the notion that, oh, we're going to send these Jews over there to spy for us. And Canaris was able to sell that idea and make it, all those people got out. But Hans von Doyani, who was Dietrich Bonhoeffer's brother, who is an attorney first in the Ministry of Justice, then he was brought into Abwehr because Canaris knew he was anti-Nazi. They were moving these people out of the country, and he said, well, I don't want these people to have to leave everything behind. I don't want them to be poverty-stricken when we save their lives. We're shipping them to Switzerland, but they're going to be poverty-stricken. So they finagled the books at Abwehr, and they've put together what was then about $100,000 US to give these people a stake to start over. And that juggling of the books is eventually what caused other people within the Abwehr who were not conspirators to wonder what the heck is going on here with these, what's happening over here. And that slowly starts to put the focus on what came to be called the Black Orchestra, meaning people within the German government, military and some civilian, who were conspiring against Hitler. Now, had Doyani not tried to do the right thing with those people, maybe that exposure and that spotlight would not have been turned on them. And again, that program could not have happened without Canaris's permission. So he's a tough guy to get a handle on and figure out.
And it is great watching Nazis look like idiots because there's plenty of it in here, and history shows us that they were just these vicious, awful, disgusting people. Totally true. But there is just a nice little thing about seeing a bunch of people bamboozling them over and over because they're known as great record keepers and they were very strict. But yeah, if we just move a couple of things here, we're going to tell them we're going to do that. And a lot of times they just completely missed it. I mean, the amount of close calls throughout this book, you just keep saying, oh, this is where it's going to turn. Oh, no, wait, this is when they're going to catch him this time. And just it keeps going. It keeps going the whole time.
Yeah, and there's no doubt the Nazi war machine was a well-oiled machine. But in any machine, particularly at the size of the machine we are speaking of, there's going to be cracks and fissures and little spots within that machine of people operating in the bureaucracy that can get around stuff, or they're just plain make mistakes or do stupid things. It's not a perfect machine. There has never been a perfect political or war machine. It's also the ingenuity of the people who were within this conspiracy and what they were able to do at an enormous risk. One thing I became more appreciative of in reading this, researching this, was that you gain I've had people say to me, gosh, why didn't somebody just pull out a gun and shoot Hitler? I mean, it sounds good. It's not quite as simple as that when you're living in the moment there and where your whole family could maybe be killed. There was that policy of collective revenge over there, that if you're guilty of a crime, well, so is your whole family, even if they had nothing to do with it. So if I'm a conspirator and my conspiracy fails and fails miserably, I could also be killing my entire family in addition to not accomplishing my goal of overthrowing the government. So there's reasons why these guys were trepidatious and why it was not as simple as we tend to think it is. And the other thing they were thinking of is, if we move on Hitler and it's not 100% successful, are we going to start a civil war within our own country, which was another factor they were thinking of. And then secondary to that, if we are successful, what if the Allies are just as vindictive to us as they were after World War I? That was always in the back of their minds. The terms of the Versailles Treaty after World War I were so onerous for Germany. As these conspirators were reaching out, particularly to the British during the war, one of their big fears was that, okay, we're going to move on Hitler. In a way, are we going to wind up screwing our country even worse if the retribution is going to be so severe? What guarantees can you give us that if we move on Hitler, there won't be, full flat-out retribution like there was after World War I? The image that came to me was that a lot of these guys were really in a box canyon. What is the way out of the dilemma they were in? And yet so many, all of them really, were morally motivated to do something. Helmuth Moltke was an attorney brought into Abwehr. Again, he's a conspirator, came from a very well-known and historic German military family. in the early stages of Germany invades Russia in June of 41. And in the early stages of that, Moltke's getting casualty reports, at work. And he sits down and he looks at this. And at that point, he was seeing numbers of 15,000 Russians being killed a week and 10,000 Germans. And so he actually sits down and does the math as to how many people are getting killed per day over there, how many people are getting killed per minute over there. At one point, he figured out it was 10 Russians and 4 Germans every minute. And then he writes a letter to his wife and he says, how can I sit here in my flat drinking a cup of tea, knowing what I know is going on over there? And he has a quote to the effect of, what am I going to say when I'm asked, and what did you do during that time? So it weighed heavily on this guy's conscience every day, and other people as well, as we got to do something, but we're not exactly sure what we can do to get out of this. In his situation, he actually went out into the field and met with German generals in several different countries, and particularly trying to encourage these guys to live by what's the Hague Convention is basically your rules of warfare, to avoid killing so many, particularly when they moved into Russia. They were, well, also in Poland, but I mean, they were killing so many civilians. And that was, he was trying to get these guys, regardless of what Hitler says, don't do this. And they would say yes to him when he was out in the field, but then Moltke would come back and sit in a meeting in Berlin with these other German generals. And he's saying, listen, you got to, just for safekeeping of our own soldiers in terms of retribution and things, we've got to stop these civilian casualties. At that point, nobody was going to tell Hitler he was wrong.
So now this germ of an idea started with Bonhoeffer, right? So I want to ask you this question, purely hypothetical. Somebody says, hey, I'm going to give you $10 million. I want you to write a biography of somebody from this book, but it can't be Bonhoeffer. Who would you choose?
I would have 2 choices. One would be Helmut Moltke. He's a very fascinating guy and very, very well read. I mean, he was reading the Federalist Papers and stuff. I mean, he was a very smart guy. But the person that I discovered in the course of this book that really fascinated me was a gentleman by the name of Harold Polchow. And Polchow was a pastor at Tegel prison in Berlin. And he actually, his first day on the job was April 1st, 1933, which coincidentally was the day of the Jewish boycott throughout Germany, which was sort of the first organized government effort sort of targeting the Jewish people, sort of a harbinger of things to come. And his form of ministry, mirrored the war. I mean, it took a very dark turn. And what had happened is that an increasing amount of his time was spent counseling condemned prisoners in the last hours before their execution and even accompanying them into the execution chamber. And when you think about that, to be the person who is the last person that someone else engages with, on this earth, and that you're trying to ease their transition under the most awful circumstances, whatever you can do or say to make it more palatable that you're about to be hung or have your head chopped off. And he at first started keeping count of the amount of people, but he finally, the numbers got so big, all he could guesstimate, it was about 1,000 people that he had counseled this way. Just the mental stress and burden that this man carried almost every day through the war is just fascinating to me. And how he did not, either have a breakdown or take his own life is beyond me. And in fact, he and Helmut Moltke became friends and fellow resistors during the war. Polchow, outside of his prison activity, was active in another grassroots group that was sneaking food to Jews, finding Jews jobs when they were, so many Jews couldn't work anywhere. There was all these little pockets of resistors trying to help them along the way. So he was risking his life both in and out of prison and sneaking letters in and out of prison from the prisoners to their families. But Moltke commented to his wife in a couple of letters that Harold Polchow's composure and equanimity under this kind of stress, he just said, I don't know how this guy holds it together. So Polchow would be a person I would be curious to know more about.
He was the one that jumped out to me too, and I'm glad that you said he did with you, because I'm trying not to pronounce names before you do it first, because I will butcher them. What I kept thinking about as he's seeing these people off to be executed is he knew these people were innocent. He knew these people didn't do horrible things that bad people were actually executing them. And that's what really ratcheted it up for me, is that he couldn't even distance himself and say, all right, this person did something horrible and now they have to pay for it. He's sitting there saying, I keep watching innocent people die. I really expected every chapter to just be like, this is when Polchow killed himself, where he finally just couldn't handle it anymore. You wouldn't have questioned it for a second, because it had to be a horrific life to be part of the mechanism that was clearly murdering innocent people for years.
Yeah. And by all accounts, I was able to speak to some people. There was, I don't know if he's still alive. He was 95 when I spoke to him. There's a gentleman by the name of Peter Sitchell. He was with the OSS, but he knew Polchow right after the war. And he's a guy who, parenthetically or coincidentally, went to become the founder of Blue Nun Wine. He had met Polchow right after the war, and he said, in fact, he was out sailing with them one day, and they got into a really horrific storm. Polchow being a minister, not a lifelong seaman, but he said, I was very impressed with this guy's composure and coolness under pressure. Also, Helmuth Moltke's children are still alive. And I spoke to his son, Casper, and also Harold Polchow's son is alive and he lives in the Dallas area. But he was talking about how his father considered it kind of he was obviously a man of faith, considered it a gift of God that he was able to maintain his equilibrium through just the most horrific situation. I just can't imagine, again, it'd be horrible to have to deal with that once or twice, but to have to look into the eyes of 1,000 people that are doomed, and you're the last person there that's trying to buck them up and somehow usher them across the threshold. I don't know if anyone in history has gone through something, an ordeal like that. It's just one of the peculiar, ugly dynamics of the Nazi regime, that someone would even be called upon to have that job as a pastor. It's mind-boggling.
Is it difficult having conversations with the descendants of people? Even, we're talking about good people here, but they were in horrific situations. And, we're losing the ability to talk about a lot of people who know exactly what World War II was like. But, you're a journalist too, which means you do these things all the time. Is it hard to have those conversations? Do you have to be so careful and make sure that you're not inadvertently opening up a wound or going too deep into something? Do you have to just kind of look at them and say, I'm watching their body language to make sure I'm not getting somewhere that's going to kind of throw them off?
That's in the back of your mind a little bit, and it wouldn't be necessarily exclusive to this project. There could be a lot of projects that involves, some sort of a tragedy or death where you've got to walk a little carefully. But also in this instance, they've thought about a lot of this before. I mean, it's something they lived with, like an ambush interview after an airplane goes down and one of your relatives gets killed or something. I mean, this is a situation that unfolded over a period of time. And also people have reflected on it for a period of time. So there's always wounds there, but they're not necessarily fresh. It was very interesting. I had a conversation with someone who doesn't figure directly in the book. Martin Niemöller was one of the pastors in Germany who was active in the resistance in his own way and was arrested and put in Sachsenhausen concentration camp in solitary confinement for a number of years. He survives the war, and he later marries a woman by the name of Sybil Niemöller, who is still alive. I've lost track of her the past year or two, but she was alive as of when I spoke with her. She was living in suburban Philadelphia, and she was in her close to mid-90s at that point. What was fascinating to me is that she mentioned that sometimes she will go on YouTube and watch the executions of the Nazis after the war. And it wasn't lurid for her, but there was some sort of catharsis in that for her, because her father was in the military, and he was on the fringes of the resistance. He wound up getting captured by the Russians after the war and died in a Russian prison camp. But certainly she knew a lot of people and actually had met Hitler as a girl. Hitler had come to her school and she shook the Führer's hand. It's just a sense of certainly how understandably deep those wounds are, that it was still somewhat of a cathartic release from her to switch on YouTube and watch some of these people get their just retribution.
She wanted to make sure they're still dead, just in case.
Exactly. And can't blame her.
Well, listen, Tom, we've talked about it. It's a fantastic book. Now, one of the reasons we founded History Nerds United, because, and World War II is something too, it's taught a lot in school. People think it's boring. Like, they're like, I've learned everything about it. I don't need this nonfiction history. It's boring. I don't want to read it. If one of those people was sitting in front of you and said, why should I read White Nights and the Black Orchestra? What would you say?
You have to think of history as really just contemporary life written in the past tense. I mean, it's not that those people are any different than we are. You still have the same hopes and fears and love and death, everything that we've gone through. History well written is just as compelling as fiction well written. It's a question of presentation and how it's handled. What I was striving to do, and what I'd like to think I did with this book, was to, again, legitimate history, but done in such a way that, as a story that draws in readers, and it's meant for a general interest audience. It's not an academic audience, and that's not to say that the content is dumbed down, but it's just how you present material makes a difference in how a reader can absorb the material. It's a reader-friendly look at history. Again, as we were speaking of before, World War II does resonate with what's going on in the world today. And there was a quote that stuck with me from Edgar Maurer, who was a reporter for the Chicago Daily News, who was reporting out of Germany. He won the Pulitzer Prize in 1933 for his coverage of Hitler. Subsequently had to leave the country because it wasn't safe for him to remain there. And his wife had a wonderful quote, Lillian Maurer, about their time in Germany and how they loved their years there. They had friends there, but she said, it was like watching someone you love go mad and do horrible things. And I think there's a sense of the times we're living in the world right now that a lot of it is not making sense to a lot of us right now. And that notion that the world has somehow flipped on its axis, and it's interesting and perhaps instructive to go back and look at people that were dealing with these issues 80 years ago, but the issues are very much still with us, and how people respond to the issues is still very much with us. So history continues to resonate.
Well, Tom, it's fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on to talk to us about it.
Thank you, Brandon. Be good.
And that's it for this episode. Tom, thank you so much for coming on. White Nights and the Black Orchestra, one of my favorites of the year. Go out and get it, nerds. In the meantime, hit us up Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Leave us comments. Leave us reviews on the podcast on whatever app you use. 5 stars, please. We need it. And if you're going to start buying stuff for Christmas, please make sure to use our Amazon link. You can find it on the blog, and we'll also be sending it out on social media. Until then, nerds, stay cool.